After burying my son 12 months ago, a $523 electric bill arrived from his supposedly abandoned farm. That night, I drove out there through the freezing snow. About 200 meters away, I saw an SUV parked in the yard and thick smoke rising from the chimney. What I discovered next completely shattered my world. My name is Harrison Cole. I'm 70 years old. For 40 years, I worked as a commercial building contractor, laying foundations, pouring concrete, and managing heavy industrial job sites. I spent my whole life working with my hands and my brain, calculating load limits, electrical currents, and structural integrity. I built a good, comfortable life so my family would always feel secure. A year ago, my entire world collapsed when my son, Matthew, lost his life in a terrible car accident. I thought I'd never recover from the pain of burying my own flesh and blood. I thought the worst day of my life was already behind me. But I was wrong. It all started on a quiet Tuesday evening in late November. Winter in upstate New York was just starting to show its brutal edge, with a biting wind howling outside my window. I was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking black coffee, and going through a pile of forwarded mail. Most of it was useless flyers and credit card offers. Then my hand stopped. It was a thin white envelope. The return address read New York State Electric and Gas. The name printed on the front brought a sharp, heavy pain to my chest. It was addressed to Matthew Cole. Ever since the accident, mail from his old place had been forwarded to my home. His farm was located on the outskirts of town, spread across a vast plot of land. For Nutsutz, it had been locked up and completely abandoned. My daughter-in-law, Rachel, had told me she couldn't bear to go back there. She said it held too many painful memories, so she put a padlock on the gate, shut off the main valves, and left it sitting in the elements until she felt ready to put it on the market. I stared at the envelope for a long time. Normally, a vacant property might generate a tiny service fee, maybe $10 or $15 a month, just to keep the meter active. I slid my thumb under the flap and tore it open, expecting a nominal charge. I pulled out the paper, adjusted my reading glasses, and looked at the total amount due, $52,340. Son. For a moment, I just sat there in the quiet kitchen, letting those numbers process in my mind. When you spend 40 years in construction and property management, you know exactly what numbers mean. A property sitting dark and idle cannot run up a monthly power bill like that, let alone accumulate over $50,000 in balance. A forgotten porch light might cost you a few bucks. A plugged-in refrigerator might cost $20. But a spike like this? That was no clerical error. That was the footprint of heavy, continuous power consumption. The kind of draw that only happens when industrial machinery is running day and night. My chest tightened. Something was fundamentally, terribly wrong. My grief instantly took a back seat, replaced by the razor-sharp analytical instincts of a man who spent his life solving problems on job sites. I didn't call Rachel to ask about it. I didn't call the electric company to complain about a faulty meter. I knew what I had to do. I grabbed my heavy winter coat from the rack by the door, snatched my truck keys off the counter, and walked out into the freezing night. The cold wind hit me immediately, swirling thick snowflakes that stung my face. But I barely felt it. I climbed into my truck, turned the ignition, and put it in drive. The farm was about a 40-minute drive out of town, nestled at the end of a long, winding dirt road surrounded by dense pine trees. The drive felt like an eternity. The rhythmic scrap of the windshield wipers clearing heavy snow matched the anxious pounding of my heart. 1,000 possibilities flashed through my mind. Were there squatters? Did someone break in and set up camp? Or was it something else? Every mile brought a fresh wave of dread, mixing with the lingering sorrow of losing Matthew. As I turned onto the final stretch of country road leading to the property line, I made a calculated decision. I didn't drive straight up to the main gate. If someone was trespassing on my late son's property, I didn't want to announce my arrival with blinding headlights and a roaring engine. I pulled my truck onto a hidden, narrow logging trail about 200 meters from the front entrance. I cut the engine, killed the lights, and sat in complete darkness for a moment, listening to the wind howl through the pines. Reaching into the glove compartment, I pulled out my heavy-duty binoculars. Stepping out of the truck, the snow crunched loudly under my boots. The air was well below freezing, the chill cutting right through my thick coat. But my entire focus was locked on the farm down the road. Using the shadow of the woods as cover, I moved slowly and carefully through the tree line. When I finally reached a vantage point with a clear view of the property, I raised the binoculars and adjusted the focus dial. My breath caught in my throat. The farm wasn't abandoned at all, far from it. The main house was dark, but the massive corrugated steel woodworking shop at the back of the property was lit up like a Christmas tree. My son's city, bright, harsh, industrial light, spilled out from around the edges of the heavy metal doors. And then I saw it. Thick, dark smoke was rolling steadily from the workshop's exhaust chimney. Someone was running a heavy wood-burning stove inside to keep that massive space warm. I lowered the binoculars for a second, rubbing my eyes, thinking the wind-blown snow was tricking my vision. I raised them again. My hands started to shake, and it wasn't from the freezing temperature. Sitting directly in front of the illuminated workshop, resting heavy and silent in the falling snow, was a vehicle. It was a black Ford Explorer. I zoomed in, cutting through the falling snow. My eyes locked onto the rear bumper. I stared at the custom license plate. Those letters and numbers were burned into my memory. My stomach dropped into a bottomless pit. A wave of physical nausea hit me, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the freezing winter air. It was the exact same make, the exact same model, and it bore the exact same custom plate as the vehicle my son was driving the night he died. The police reports, the insurance adjusters, the paramedics. They had all told me Matthew's car was completely crushed, turned into a twisted pile of scrap iron that could only be sold for metal. Yet here it sat, fully intact, that I could see faint white trails, exhaust, curling into the coals of exhaust, curling into the cold night sky. I stood frozen in the tree line, snow building up on my shoulders. How was this possible? Was I losing my mind? Had grief finally pushed me over the edge into hallucinations? I took a step forward, my heavy boots crunching loudly in the deep snow, determined to march down there and pull open those barn doors. I had to know who was inside. I had to know why my dead son's car was sitting on his supposedly abandoned farm. I took another step, anger rising hot and sharp in my chest, completely overpowering my fear. But right before my foot landed again, a sudden, violent vibration startled me. In the dead silence of the snowy woods, the buzzing of my phone in my coat pocket felt as loud as a siren. I froze, my heart in my throat. I frantically scrambled, shoving my cold, trembling hands deep into my pocket to mute it before anyone in that barn could hear. I pulled out the phone, shielding the bright screen with my other hand. I looked down at the caller ID, expecting a telemarketer or a wrong number. The name flashing on the screen made my blood run cold. It was Rachel. My daughter-in-law was calling me at 2 in the morning, at the exact moment I was standing in the dark, staring at my dead son's ghost car. I stepped back into the thick cover of the pine trees, sinking deep into the powdery snow. My aging heart battered violently against my ribs. The phone vibrated relentlessly in my hand, threatening to give away my position. I quickly pressed answer, bringing the cold device to my ear, forcing myself to breathe steadily. "Hello," I answered, my voice coming out rasper than I intended. "Dad," Rachel said. Her voice was thick with heavy tears trembling, sounding completely broken. "I'm so sorry to bother you this late. I couldn't sleep. I've been staring at the clock non-stop." I swallowed hard, the freezing air burning my throat. "It's all right, Rachel. What's wrong?" "It's past midnight," she whispered, her voice breaking into a soft sob. "It's officially the anniversary. It's been a full year since Matthew left us. I just felt so unbelievably lonely, and I needed to hear your voice. You're the only one who truly understands this specific pain. A year ago, those words would have shattered my heart. I would have cried with her, offering every ounce of comfort a father could give to a grieving daughter-in-law. But, standing in the freezing dark, staring at an idling vehicle that was supposed to be a crushed cube of scrap metal, her tears felt entirely different. They felt calculated. I needed to test the waters. I needed to see how deep this deception went. "I miss him too, sweetheart," I said, keeping my tone carefully measured and warm. I was actually thinking about him tonight too. In fact, I was going through some forwarded mail from the farm. A strange bill came from the electric company today. Instant, dead silence fell over the line. It was only a fraction of a second, but for a man who spent 40 years negotiating complex construction contracts, I knew exactly what a defensive pause sounded like. "A bill?" Rachel asked, her voice recovering its trembling innocence almost immediately. "For the farm? That must be a mistake, or just a basic service fee." "That's what I thought," I replied smoothly, leaning against the rough bark of a pine tree to steady myself. But it wasn't a basic fee. It was over $500 for the month. That's a massive amount of power for a property that's been locked up and empty for a year. I was worried someone might have broken in and set up camp. I was even thinking about calling the local sheriff to have them take a look. "Oh no, please don't do that," she said quickly. The urgency in her voice was unmistakable. Then she let out a long, shaky sigh, playing the role of an overwhelmed widow to perfection. "I'm sorry, Dad. I should have told you. A few months ago, I hired a local caretaker. His name is Greg. You know how brutal winters get up here. The temperature drops so fast, and I was terrified the main pipes would freeze and burst. That would ruin the foundation and the walls entirely." It sounded unbelievably logical. Winters in upstate New York are notoriously unforgiving, and burst pipes can easily cause tens of thousands of dollars in water damage. "So," Rachel continued, confidence returning to her voice, "I pay Greg to go out there a couple of nights a week. He runs industrial space heaters and operates heavy-duty water pumps just to keep the lines clear and the property warm. Those machines draw a ton of electricity, which explains why the bill is so high. I just wanted to protect the place until I was emotionally ready to put it on the market. I didn't want to burden you with complex financial details." I stared at the thick smoke continuing to billow from the workshop's chimney. A caretaker running heaters wouldn't need a roaring wood fire at 2 in the morning. But I played along, nodding in the dark, even though she couldn't see me. "That makes sense," I said softly. "Protecting the property value is smart. But Rachel, there was also a DMV notice mixed in the mail. A registration renewal for a black Ford Explorer. Matthew's car was completely totaled in the crash. Why would there be an active registration sent straight to the farm? This time, the silence on the line lasted much longer. When she finally spoke, she let out a loud, pained cry that echoed through the phone speaker. It was a masterclass in pure emotional manipulation. "I'm so embarrassed," she sobbed, the words pouring out between heavy gasps. "I couldn't let go, Dad. A few months ago, after I received the life insurance payout, my therapist suggested finding healthy ways to cope. But I drove past a dealership, and I saw it. The year, the model, even the black paint. It was identical to Matthew's car. I bought it with cash. I even paid to transfer his custom license plate over." She paused to blow her nose, painting a vivid picture of a woman drowning in grief. "I know it sounds completely crazy. I know it's not healthy, but sometimes I just sit in the driver's seat, close my eyes, and pretend he's still here. I couldn't bear parking it in my driveway in town because the neighbors would ask questions, so I parked it at the farm. When Greg works at the property, I let him use it to haul firewood and supplies. Please don't think I'm insane." I closed my eyes, letting the freezing wind hit my face. The lie was seamless. It neatly explained the massive power bill, the smoke from the chimney, and the ghost car sitting in the snow. It preyed directly on a grieving father's desperate desire to protect what little family he had left. "I don't think you're insane, Rachel," I said gently, forcing every bit of fatherly warmth I had left into my voice. "Grief makes us do complex things. Get some sleep. We'll talk tomorrow." "Thank you, Dad. I love you," she whispered before hanging up. I lowered the phone, letting out a long breath. For a brief second, I actually wanted to believe her. I wanted to turn around, walk back to my truck, and drive home. I took a step back into the deep snow. Suddenly, a blinding flash of bright blue light exploded from the frosted windows of the metal workshop. It flickered violently, casting sharp, jagged shadows across the snow-covered yard, accompanied by a faint but aggressive crackling sound. My blood turned to pure ice. That wasn't a space heater. That was the unmistakable flash of a high-voltage arc welder. A caretaker doesn't weld heavy structural steel at 2 a.m. I didn't run. Moving too fast in deep snow at my age is an easy way to break a bone, and right now I needed my body to be as sharp as my mind. I carefully backtracked through the thick pines, keeping my head down against the biting wind, leaving the humming workshop and its flashing blue lights behind. I climbed back into the freezing cab of my truck and started the engine as quietly as possible. On the 40-minute drive home, I stayed completely silent. I didn't even turn on the heater. I needed the freezing air to keep me wide awake. My contractor instincts were screaming. A high-voltage arc welder demands an incredible amount of electricity. It requires a dedicated 220-volt circuit and draws massive amperage. You only use a setup like that when you're fusing heavy structural steel or modifying heavy machinery. A caretaker hired to keep pipes from freezing would have no use for industrial welding equipment. Rachel lied to me, and the effortless perfection of her lie made it clear she had practiced those lines in front of a mirror 100 times. But why? What was actually going on out in that dark place? When I finally pulled into my driveway, the digital clock on the dash read almost 3 a.m. I unlocked my front door and walked right past the stairs leading up to my bedroom. Sleep was completely out of the question. I walked straight down the hallway into my home office and turned on the small brass desk lamp. The rooms was lined with heavy metal filing cabinets, containing 40 years of my commercial construction business records, along with a single locked drawer that held everything related to Matthew. I unlocked that drawer and pulled out the thick manila folder labeled with my son's estate settlement. I spread the documents across my polished oak desk. I needed to see the numbers. Numbers don't cry, and numbers don't lie. I began flipping through bank statements, life insurance payouts, and the final debt settlement sheet Rachel had handed me 8 months ago. My eyes scanned every line of print, searching for hidden cracks in the foundation. My eyes locked onto one specific bank transfer receipt. It was a withdrawal from my primary retirement account for exactly $300,000. I remembered the day I signed that wire transfer like it was yesterday. Rachel had come to my house, looking frail, pale, and completely exhausted. She sat in the exact chair across from my desk, holding her face in her hands and sobbing uncontrollably. She told me that before the accident, Matthew had secretly taken out massive lines of credit with private material suppliers. She claimed he had purchased hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of structural steel, concrete, and heavy lumber for a massive commercial project that never got off the ground because he died. According to Rachel's, the private lenders were threatening to foreclose on her house and take everything Matthew had worked so hard to build. The haunting pain. I couldn't stand the thought of my son's legacy being tarnished by unpaid debts. I couldn't let my young daughter-in-law lose her home. So the next morning, I went to the bank and wired her $300,000 in cash to clear his name. I didn't ask to see a single receipt. I didn't ask to see supplier invoices. I just paid it, placing complete trust in my grieving daughter-in-law. But looking at these papers now, knowing she had just lied to my face about an industrial welding operation at a property that was supposed to be empty, a sickening realization hit me. If the car in the snow was a lie, and the late-night caretaker was a lie, then those massive material debts were very likely a lie, too. I needed to know exactly what she did with my $300,000. I sat back in my heavy leather chair and booted up my desktop computer. The monitor cast a pale, cold glow across the dark room. As a former contractor, I still maintained my login credentials for the New York State Business Licensing Database. It was a secure portal used by commercial developers to verify insurance coverage and active status for any builder operating within the state. When a registered contractor passes away, their license is supposed to be frozen immediately and eventually canceled by the state board during probate. I entered my password, navigated to the search directory, and typed Matthew Cole into the query box. To ensure complete accuracy, I added his specific federal employer identification number from the estate folder. I hit enter and waited for the page to load. I expected to see a bold red banner reading deceased or legally inactive. Instead, the page refreshed to display a bright green status indicator. The word active sat proudly at the top of the screen, mocking my grief. My jaw clenched so hard my teeth hurt. Matthew's commercial contracting license hadn't been frozen by state authorities. It had been officially renewed just 4 months ago. I clicked on the Recent Activity tab, and my stomach plummeted. Under my dead son's name, using his respected company credentials, someone had recently submitted and officially won 3 massive state highway equipment logistics contracts. These were lucrative, multi-million-dollar government bids. Someone was actively using a dead man's business license to land massive state contracts, completely bypassing standard, rigorous Background checks because Matthew's company had a golden reputation built over a decade of honest work. I scrolled down frantically, reviewing the contact information section for the newly awarded contracts, my eyes scanning the fine print. The main operational phone number listed wasn't Rachel's. I moved my cursor over to the emergency corporate contact field. The name listed made my blood freeze in my veins. It was Todd. Todd was Matthew's former business partner. He was the man sitting in the passenger seat the night my son's car reportedly hit black ice and rolled down a steep, rocky ravine. Todd was the miraculous sole survivor who walked away from that fatal crash with nothing more than a broken collarbone and a few minor scratches on his face. He had stood right beside my son's grave, weeping on my shoulder, swearing to God he would have given anything to swap places with Matthew. And now, after 12 long, painful months, Todd was running a ghost operation under my dead son's name, quietly harvesting the financial rewards of his supposed tragic death while I sat alone in the dark. The undeniable truth was unfolding right before my eyes. My son's legacy was being exploited by his best friend. I knew right then that I had to stop their scheme. I needed to look into her eyes. I needed to face the woman who wept at my son's grave, working alongside the man who walked away from that crash, secretly operating a fraudulent empire in his name. The next morning, I picked up the phone and called Rachel, putting every bit of calculated exhaustion into my voice. I asked her to come over for a traditional Sunday roast, telling her the house felt too quiet and I just needed some familiar company. She agreed right away, her tone dripping with the same rehearsed sympathy I heard on the phone during the blizzard. I spent the rest of the weekend preparing the meal, keeping my hands busy chopping vegetables and seasoning the meat so my mind wouldn't burn up with anger. When the doorbell finally rang on Sunday afternoon, I took a deep breath, buried the rage deep in my chest, and opened the door. Rachel stood on my front porch in a somber black wool coat and a simple gray scarf, looking every bit the grieving widow the world expected to see. She gave me a fragile, brave smile and stepped inside, bringing the crisp autumn chill with her. But my eyes were trained to notice details that didn't belong. As she handed me her coat, I saw it. Hanging from her arm was a matte black leather handbag. I might be a retired contractor, but I know luxury when I see it. That was a high-end designer bag, an exclusive piece that required months on a waiting list, costing more than a brand-new pickup truck. A woman, supposedly drowning in her late husband's construction debts, doesn't casually carry a $30,000 purse to Sunday dinner. I hung her coat in the hallway closet without saying a word about the bag. We walked into the dining room, and I pulled out her chair, playing the role of a frail, lonely father-in-law to perfection. When she reached across the table to pour herself a glass of water, her gray sweater sleeve slid up just a fraction of an inch. A heavy glint of polished gold caught the warm light of the chandelier. It was a brand-new, diamond-encrusted luxury watch, the kind executives buy to celebrate massive corporate acquisitions. She pulled her sleeve down quickly, a flash of panic crossing her face before she smoothed it over with another sorrowful smile. I served the roast, keeping the conversation light and nostalgic at first. I asked how her week had been, and she gave me a practiced, grief-stricken update about how hard it was to manage the house alone, about how sorrow still hit her in unpredictable waves. I nodded sympathetically, eating my food while a cold disgust settled in my stomach. It was time to test the waters. I shifted the topic to my past. talking about how much the construction industry had changed since I retired. I mentioned an old buddy of mine complaining about outrageously inaccurate number. A standard Caterpillar accurate number, claiming a standard throughout an out-irrated Caterpillar excavator ran about $1,200 a week nowadays. I shook my head, pretending to be baffled by this made-up inflation, stating that no honest contractor could actually turn a profit with overhead that high. Before Matthew passed away, Rachel didn't even know the difference between a backhoe and a bulldozer. She had zero interest in heavy machinery logistics or the financial realities of commercial contracting. But now, she didn't even hesitate. Without missing a beat, she took a sip of red wine, shook her head, and let a confident, almost arrogant smile settle on her lips. Looking me straight in the eyes, she casually corrected my math. She pointed out that $2,200 a week was a massive lowball for today's market. She smoothly explained that a Caterpillar 320 series actually ran closer to $3,000 a week, depending heavily on the specific hydraulic attachments and total hours logged on the engine. How domestic supply chain issues were driving up secondary market values for used industrial loaders. As those highly specialized technical terms spilled out of her mouth, she suddenly realized who she was talking to. She cut herself off mid-sentence, her eyes darting nervously down to her plate. The confident businesswoman vanished, instantly replaced by the stuttering, sorrowful widow. She quickly muttered something about reading a random article online and desperately tried to steer the conversation back to the cold weather. I just smiled, nodded, and let her ramble. The trap had snapped shut. The bait was taken. She possessed highly specialized knowledge of heavy machinery, the kind of market expertise you only gain by actively managing a large-scale industrial operation. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of fake pleasantries. I played the tired old man to perfection, yawning and mentioning how the cold made my joints ache. Rachel seized the chance to leave, claiming she had an early appointment the next morning and needed to rest. I walked her to the front door and fetched her heavy black wool coat from the hallway closet. As I held it out for her to slip her arms in, her movement was a bit too hasty. Her hand brushed against the edge of a deep side pocket. A small, crumpled piece of white paper slipped from the fabric and floated silently to the hardwood floor, landing right at the edge of the entryway rug. Rachel didn't notice it fall. She wrapped her scarf tightly around her neck, gave me one last fragile, trembling hug, and stepped out into the freezing night. I stood in the doorway, watching her climb into a sleek silver sedan and drive down the quiet suburban street. Once her taillights vanished around the corner, I closed the heavy wooden door and threw the deadbolt. I looked down at the floor, bending over slowly, my knees popping softly. In the quiet house, I picked up the crumpled paper. Under the bright light of the entryway chandelier, I smoothed it out. It was an automated toll plaza receipt from the State Thruway Authority. As I stared at the printed ink, my heart turned completely to ice. The toll booth was located just 2 miles from that supposedly abandoned farm in upstate New York. I checked the timestamp at the bottom of the slip. The date and exact time matched the precise hour I had been standing in the freezing snow, staring at the flashing blue lights of that arc welder. The lie was no longer just a suspicion. It was a tangible reality sitting in the palm of my hand. The woman who promised to honor my son's memory was actively destroying it. She was doing it with my money, and she thought I was too blind to notice a thing. I sat in the quiet hallway for a long time, staring at that small piece of crumpled paper. The toll receipt was the ultimate proof of Rachel's deception. Her act as a grieving widow was an elaborate illusion. The realization that my daughter-in-law was actively working to destroy my son's memory and my financial security hit me like a wrecking ball. But for a man my age, anger is a dangerous luxury. If I let emotion take the wheel, I would make fatal mistakes. I was up against a highly organized operation, and I was completely out of my depth. I needed to move strategically. I needed to vanish without raising a single red flag. The next morning, I called Rachel. Keeping my voice light, I pretended to be the tired, heartbroken old man she thought she had successfully manipulated. I told her that the approaching anniversary of Matthew's passing was taking a heavy toll on my physical health. I explained that I had impulsively booked a 3-week senior cruise to the Florida Keys. I made a point to emphasize that I would be completely disconnected out on the open sea with 0 cell service. Rachel played her part flawlessly. She told me it was a wonderful idea, that I deserved to rest and heal, and promised to keep an eye on my house while I was away. She sounded genuinely relieved. She thought I was completely out of the picture. Instead of heading to the airport, I turned my truck in the opposite direction. I drove to a quiet stretch of highway, about 10 miles south of Matthew's farm, and checked into a run-down roadside motel. I paid cash for a 3-week stay. The room smelled faintly of stale tobacco and cheap industrial bleach. The mattress was thin, and the walls were stained, but it was perfect. It was completely untraceable. Nobody would ever think to look for a wealthy retired commercial contractor in a place like this. Once, I unpacked my meager luggage. I sat on the edge of the squeaky bed and pulled out my secure burner phone. It was time to assemble my team. I dialed a number I hadn't used in over 5 years. Jonathan Pierce answered on the second ring. Jonathan was my former corporate attorney, a ruthless, shark-like litigator who had helped me navigate the most brutal commercial construction disputes of my career. He was a man who viewed legal battles as a blood sport, and I needed his instincts. I quickly briefed him on the fraudulent highway bids, the massive material debts, and the active contractor's license. Jonathan listened in silence, his legal mind instantly shifting into high gear. He told me to stay completely hidden while he began quietly pulling every financial record and corporate filing associated with Matthew's company. My second call was to Mike Russo. Mike was a former state police detective turned private investigator. We worked together 10 years ago when a corrupt subcontractor tried to embezzle funds from one of my high-rise projects. Mike was sharp and comfortable operating in the gray areas of the law, thriving where standard authorities often moved too slowly. I gave him the motel address and told him to bring his close-heavy monitoring gear. I explained that we were going to war against my own daughter-in-law and her late husband's former business partner. 2 hours later, Mike and Jonathan were sitting in my rundown motel room. 2 imposing, formidable men occupied the cheap plastic chairs, making the cramped space feel even smaller. I spread the toll receipt, the massive power bill, and the state contractor printouts across the small round table. I told them about the black SUV, the industrial arc welder, and the unbelievable fact that Todd was listed as the primary corporate contact on multi-million-dollar highway contracts. Jonathan adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and frowned at the documents. He explained that if Todd and Rachel were using Matthew's established business identity to win state contracts, They were likely laundering illegal funds through legitimate commercial accounts. It was a classic corporate hijacking. But to prove it without tipping them off, we needed concrete, undeniable evidence of what was happening inside that heavily guarded metal workshop. Mike unzipped a large black duffel bag and pulled out a sleek military-grade laptop and a complex directional antenna. He told us that physical entry was too dangerous without knowing their security layout. But digital intrusion was a different game. If they were running a massive illegal operation out of a rural farm, they absolutely needed an internet connection to manage logistics, communicate with buyers, and process offshore banking. Mike explained that rural broadband is notoriously insecure. If we could get close enough to connect to the main router without triggering their motion sensors, he could intercept their network traffic and clone their digital footprint straight onto his laptop. That night, the temperature plummeted to a freezing 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Mike and I drove my truck down the pitch-black logging trail, parking in the exact hidden spot I had used days earlier. We trekked through the snow-covered pine forest, our breath condensing into white mist in the icy air. We stopped at the edge of the tree line, maintaining a safe visual distance from the illuminated metal barn. Smoke was rolling from the chimney again, and the blue flashes of an arc welder flickered through the frosted windows. Mike squatted in the deep snow, resting his heavy laptop on a flat tree stump. He attached the directional antenna, pointing it straight at the main house where the primary router was likely located. The freezing wind cut through my thick gloves, but adrenaline kept me locked in complete focus. I watched Mike's fingers fly across the keyboard. Lines of green code cascaded down his black screen. He was running a packet sniffer, a program designed to capture and analyze data floating through the farm's wireless network. After 10 agonizing minutes in the freezing cold, a small progress bar on his screen flashed blue. Mike looked up at me, a cold expression on his weathered face. He had broken through the firewall. He opened a newly decrypted file and motioned for me to lean closer to the glowing display. I bent down, squinting at the complex digital dashboard. I expected to see standard heating control software, or perhaps basic financial spreadsheets. Instead, the screen displayed a sophisticated, encrypted, logistics tracking interface. Dozens of active cargo manifests, shipping container schedules, and international routing numbers covered the screen. Mike pointed to a specific column on the dashboard. The data packets they were actively transmitting had nothing to do with keeping water pipes from freezing. They were monitoring real-time GPS tracking codes and altered vehicle identification numbers. This supposedly abandoned farm in upstate New York was serving as the digital command center for a massive, highly organized criminal ring. They were actively managing the illegal international export of millions of dollars in stolen heavy construction machinery. We crouched in the snow-covered tree line for another painful 40 minutes. The biting winter wind lashed relentlessly against my heavy wool coat, but the anger burning deep in my chest held the bitter cold at bay. Finally, the heavy metal door of the workshop groaned open. Harsh halogen light spilled across the snow, illuminating the massive front grille of the black Ford Explorer. The engine roared to life, its deep rumble echoing across the deserted farm. We watched in silence as the vehicle backed up, turned around, and accelerated down the winding dirt road toward the main highway. Mike waited 10 minutes just to be certain the driver wouldn't double back for a forgotten tool. Then he gave me a quick nod. We stepped out of the woods, deliberately walking in the tire tracks left by the SUV to hide our footsteps in the fresh snow. As we approached the massive metal building, Mike pulled a professional lock-picking kit from his tactical jacket. He stepped up to the side access door and began inspecting the deadbolt. I simply reached out, gently pushed him aside, and slid my hand under the weather stripping at the bottom of the door frame. I felt around until my fingers touched a hidden miniature magnetic key box. I pulled it out, retrieved the spare key, and unlocked the door with a quiet click. Mike looked at me, visibly surprised. I said nothing. I didn't need to explain how I knew where the spare key was hidden, because years ago, I installed that door myself. A decade ago, my son and I poured the concrete foundation for this barn. We spent an entire summer framing it, wiring it, and installing the heavy corrugated steel roof. Every inch of this building held a memory of a time when we were a complete, happy family. Now, it was a crime scene. We stepped into the pitch-black workshop. The air was thick with the pungent stench of fresh industrial paint and ozone. Mike pulled out a small flashlight with a red filter and swept the beam across the vast interior. The red light revealed a space that had been completely transformed. It was no longer the simple woodworking shop where my son built custom furniture on weekends. It had been turned into a highly organized, professional chop shop for heavy construction equipment. Parked in the center of the concrete floor was a massive Caterpillar front loader. It was half-painted in a bright, generic yellow, completely obscuring the original factory decals. Surrounding the machine were heavy-duty grinders, chemical paint strippers, and specialized welding torches. I walked slowly toward the back corner of the building, my boots stepping over tangled power cords and scattered metal debris. Against the far wall, I found a heavy workbench covered in metal nameplates. I picked one up in the dim red light and examined it closely. It was a VIN plate. Beside it sat a high-precision metal stamping press and a stack of completely blank registration tags. They were actively grinding off original serial numbers from stolen machinery and stamping brand new, fake identities onto the equipment before shipping them out. The scale of the operation was staggering. Millions of dollars in stolen commercial property were moving right through the building. My son and I had built together. Mike tapped my shoulder, drawing my attention back to the task. He handed me 2 miniature wireless micro cameras from his duffel, busty bag. We needed to place them strategically to capture clear facial features and audio without being detected. I knew the structural layout better than anyone. Climbing a steel service ladder till I moved along the Tahitian ducts, I moved silently along the reinforced beams. I mounted the first camera directly above the main bay doors, angling the wide lens to cover the entire primary work area where painting and metal stamping took place. I climbed down and walked to the enclosed administrative office in the far corner. I installed the second camera high up inside a dummy smoke detector, ensuring an unobstructed view of the desk and filing cabinets. The camera feeds synced perfectly with the encrypted laptop in Mike's truck. We had them completely surrounded with digital eyes. With the cameras secured, I took a moment to look around the small administrative office. This was where Matthew used to draft blueprints and manage his modest business expenses. Now, the desk was piled high with manila folders, international shipping manifests, and customs declaration forms. I pulled a penlight from my pocket and began carefully sifting through the paperwork, looking for anything that revealed their ultimate objective. The documents were appalling. They were arranging massive shipments through the port of Newark sending stolen and re-tagged machinery to buyers in South America and Eastern Europe. But a thick folder at the bottom of the pile made my breath catch in my throat. It was a blue legal binder bearing the name of a prominent offshore holding company. I flipped open the cover and began reading the dense legal language. These were commercial lease agreements for giant industrial warehouses in the Cayman Islands and Panama. 10-year leases, fully prepaid, securing storage facilities for their international smuggling syndicate. I flipped to the final page of the contract to see who was listed as the primary lessee. My eyes scanned the dense liability clauses and financial obligations. I stared at the designated signature line at the bottom of the white paper. The blood drained from my face, leaving behind a total, numb shock. I expected to see Rachel's name. I expected to see the name of any criminal accomplice she was working with to move these stolen machines out of the country. Instead, written clearly in dark blue ink, was a name I knew better than my own reflection. It was my own name, Harrison Cole. The signature was a masterpiece of forgery. The curve of the letters, the specific slant, the heavy pressure on the final stroke. It was completely indistinguishable from my real handwriting. I flipped through the rest of the binder. Every page, every offshore lease agreement, every international customs declaration bore my perfectly forged signature. The horrific scale of their plan finally clicked into place. They weren't just running a lucrative criminal enterprise out of my late son's farm. They were actively framing me for the entire operation. If federal authorities ever raided, the federal trail would point straight to a 70-year-old FETRA's retired contractor. They intended to set me up to take the fall, destroying my life, while they walked away with a massive fortune. The drive back to the dreary motel was a brutal test of my composure. Mike drove the heavy truck smoothly over the icy roads, but my hands were shaking so violently, I had to shove them deep into my pockets. The cold was no longer just the winter air outside. It was a suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. I had spent my entire adult life building an impeccable reputation in commercial construction. My name stood for integrity, hard work, and unbreakable trust. Now, that exact name was signed at the bottom of illegal international shipping manifests and offshore lease contracts. Rachel and her silent partner had weaponized my grief, weaving a legal trap and slipping it right around my neck. When we finally pushed open the flimsy door to the motel room, Jonathan was sitting right where we left him, surrounded by mountains of printed digital files. He looked up, instantly sensing the heavy shift in the room. I walked straight to the small, round table and dropped the heavy blue binder right in front of him, telling him to look at the signature line on the last page of every lease agreement. Jonathan adjusted his glasses and opened the binder. I watched the color drain from the face of a man who made his living fighting corporate predators. He looked up at me, his voice stripped of its usual aggressive confidence. He stated that this was no longer a simple case of embezzlement. They were constructing an airtight paper trail designed to frame me as the undisputed ringleader of an international smuggling syndicate. If federal agents raided that farm tonight, I would spend the rest of my life in a maximum security prison.
Mike didn't waste a single second.
Unzipping his black duffel bag, he set up his encrypted laptop alongside Jonathan's mess of legal documents. Connecting the wireless receiver, he ran a decryption sequence to patch straight into the micro cameras we had just installed inside the barn. The dark screen flickered for a brief moment before splitting into two crisp, high-definition video feeds. The first angle showed a wide view of the main floor, capturing the half-painted Caterpillar front loader and the metal stamping tools scattered across the workbench. The second angle was a tight overhead shot of the administrative desk. The audio feed hissed softly through the laptop speakers, broadcasting the hum of space heaters and the rhythmic dripping of melting snow from the corrugated steel roof. We sat in the cramped, stale motel room, bathed in the pale blue glow of the monitor. The digital clock in the corner of the screen ticked past 4 in the morning. Every passing minute felt like a physical weight on my tired shoulders. I stared at the empty, lit-up barn, my mind racing through thousands of shattered memories. I thought about Rachel standing in my house just hours ago, clutching her $30,000 handbag, playing the heartbroken widow. I thought about the $300,000 I gave her out of kindness. Money she clearly used as seed capital to build this massive criminal empire. Most of all, I kept thinking about the ghost caretaker. Who was driving that black SUV? Who possessed the technical skills to dismantle and re-tag heavy industrial equipment? We sat in heavy silence, eyes locked on the screen, waiting for the trap to spring. Suddenly, a low, distant rumble of a heavy engine echoed through the laptop speakers. Mike leaned forward, fingers hovering over the keyboard as he boosted the audio gain. The crisp crunch of heavy tires rolling over packed snow grew louder. On the first camera feed, the massive aluminum bay doors vibrated slightly. Blinding white headlight beams cut through the frosted windows, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. The vehicle was back. The heavy engine idled outside for a long time, filling the quiet motel room with a low, threatening vibration. Then, the side access door swung open. A tall figure stepped into the harsh halogen light. He wore a thick black parka, the heavy hood pulled tight over his head, completely hiding his face from the high camera angle. He turned, pushed the heavy door shut, and locked the deadbolt with a loud metallic click. Standing near the entrance, he stomped the heavy snow from his work boots. There was a familiar, confident arrogance in his movements. He didn't move like a hired laborer or a temporary caretaker checking on frozen pipes. He walked like he owned the place. He walked across the main floor, passing the Caterpillar loader without a glance, heading straight for the administrative office in the back corner. Stepping into the small office, he moved directly into the tight frame of our second camera. Stopping at the desk, his gloved hands reached up and pulled back the thick hood of his parka. When he finally looked up, catching the overhead light, the air left my lungs completely. The room began to spin. I gripped the edges of the plastic table so hard, my knuckles turned a bruised, sickly white. It was Todd, Matthew's former business partner, the man who was sitting right beside my son when his truck supposedly hit black ice. The man who survived that fatal crash almost completely unscathed. A wave of intense nausea hit me. Memories rushed back with brutal force. I remembered Todd standing in the graveyard in the freezing rain, wearing a tailored black suit. I remembered him wrapping his arms around my neck, sobbing uncontrollably on my shoulder, begging God for forgiveness, and dramatically swearing he would spend the rest of his life looking after Rachel. It had all been a sick, calculated, his performance. He hadn't been mourning his partner's death. He was celebrating the removal of an obstacle. Todd tossed his wet gloves onto the desk and reached inside his heavy jacket, pulling out a sleek, reinforced titanium briefcase. setting it under our hidden camera. He popped the metal latches open. The briefcase was packed solid with thick, band-wrapped stacks of crisp $100 bills. Leaning over the desk, Todd pulled out the fresh cash and began counting it with cold, chilling precision. The ultimate truth was undeniable. Todd was the undisputed mastermind behind this underground chop shop. Mike shifted in his plastic chair, his eyes darting between the two live video feeds, illuminating the dark room. The soft, rhythmic snap sound of Todd flicking through $100 bills echoed through the speakers, sounding like a grotesque heartbeat. Jonathan sat rigid beside me, his formidable legal mind undoubtedly cataloging every felony taking place on the screen. For several agonizing minutes, the only movement inside the metal barn was Todd systematically organizing his illegal cash into precise stacks on the desk. Then, the heavy, motion sensor light near the main gate flickered on. A second set of headlights swept across the frosted windows, casting bright white beams against the steel walls. The quiet hum of a smaller engine approached the building. I recognized that smooth, quiet idle immediately. It was the sleek silver sedan that had backed out of my driveway just hours ago. The side door swung open, and a gust of winter wind swept inside, scattering a few loose shipping manifests across the concrete floor. Rachel stepped into the lit workshop. She was still wearing the somber black wool coat and simple gray scarf she had worn to my house for Sunday roast. But as she closed the heavy metal door behind her and locked the deadbolt with a crisp, practiced motion, a sickening transformation took place. Unwrapping the scarf from her neck, she shed the heavy coat and tossed them onto a pile of wooden shipping pallets, without a care. Beneath her supposed mourning clothes, she wore a tailored crimson blouse and dark designer trousers. The fragile, trembling posture she had maintained at my dining table was completely gone. Her shoulders were pulled back, her chin raised high, and she walked with an unmistakable, predatory confidence. The illusion of the grieving widow evaporated into the freezing air, leaving behind a cold, calculating woman who was entirely in her element inside this massive criminal chop shop. She didn't look sad. She didn't look afraid. And she certainly didn't look like a woman drowning in her late husband's debt. She looked victorious. I watched in frozen horror as she walked smoothly past the half-painted Caterpillar front loader, her expensive leather boots clicking sharply against the cold concrete floor. Todd looked up from his stack of cash, a broad, arrogant smile spreading across his face as Rachel approached the desk. He didn't offer a polite nod or a respectful greeting. Instead, he stepped out from behind the cluttered desk and met her right beside the massive metal tracks of the stolen earth mover. Rachel didn't hesitate. Closing the distance between them, she wrapped her arms tightly around his neck. Todd caught her by the waist, lifting her slightly off the concrete floor as they sank into a deep, passionate embrace. They kissed with a fierce, undeniable familiarity that brought a violent, aggressive wave of nausea to my stomach. This was clearly not a fresh romance born out of shared grief. This was a deep-rooted, long-established intimacy, one that had obviously been burning bright long before my son was laid in the cold ground. Beside me, Jonathan let out a low, disgusted sigh while Mike simply adjusted the audio dial, making sure we captured every single word they were about to say. When they parted, Rachel's hands remained comfortably resting on Todd's broad chest. She tilted her head back and let out a bright, ringing laugh that echoed loudly through the hidden microphone. It was a joyful, carefree sound, one I hadn't heard from her since my son was lowered into the dark earth. "So, how was the tragic family dinner?" Todd asked, leaning casually against the bright yellow steel frame of the loader, his voice dripping with utter contempt. Rachel rolled her eyes exaggeratedly, waving a hand through the air as if dismissing a mild annoyance. "An absolute ordeal," she answered, her tone sharp, completely stripped of the trembling sorrow she performed for me. The old man roasted a dry piece of meat and acted like he should be put in an assisted living facility all night. He kept complaining about his joints. He whined about the cold, and he actually tried to tell me a standard excavator only costs $1,200 a week to rent. Can you believe I almost laughed right in his pathetic face? Todd chuckled, a low, raspy sound that made my hands clench into fists, so tight it brought physical pain. "You didn't actually correct him, did you?" he asked, crossing his arms over his chest. Rachel offered a mischievous grin, leaning closer to him. "Of course I did. I couldn't help myself." I threw the real secondary market rates right back at his face. He looked completely bewildered. He has no idea what's happening out here. He's completely blind to the real world. I felt a cold drop of sweat trickle down the back of my neck. Their belief in their own absolute invincibility was absolute. They genuinely thought I was nothing more than a heartbroken, gullible old fool who was actively funding their shockingly lavish lifestyle without asking a single question. It was the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal, executed to perfection under the guise of shared family mourning. Todd shifted his weight from the heavy machinery, walking back to the cluttered administrative desk. His greedy eyes locked onto the titanium briefcase packed with illegal currency. Reaching into the nearest pile of freshly laundered $100 bills, he pulled out an exceptionally thick stack. He casually slid it across the polished wooden surface toward Rachel. She caught it gracefully with one hand, her eyes flashing with unvarnished greed as she quickly fanned through the crisp bills. Todd leaned heavily against the wooden desk, looking straight up toward the hidden camera in the ceiling, completely unaware it was there. A cruel, malicious smirk twisted his features, turning him into a truly horrific monster. Rachel threw her head back and laughed again, a sharp, biting sound that thoroughly shattered whatever tiny sliver of fatherly hope remained deep within my chest. She shoved the massive bundle of stolen cash directly into her expensive leather handbag, shaking her head in deep amusement. "He genuinely thinks Matthew was a total failure who ruined the business," she said smoothly. "He thinks he's saving me. We're going to bleed his remaining accounts completely dry before the state board ever catches wind of the fraudulent license." Todd nodded with total, undeniable coldness, staring blankly at the ceiling, looking straight into our hidden lens as he delivered his final, heart-shattering statement. "The old fool's 300 grand bought us our first 3 stolen loaders," Todd said, his voice echoing loudly. "He practically funded his own son's replacement with his own hands." The audio equipment in the motel room hissed, but the words hung in the air like poison. "The old fool's 300 grand bought us our first 3 stolen loaders. He practically funded his own son's replacement with his own hands." I sat frozen in the cheap plastic chair. My aging lungs struggled to draw in enough air. The scale of this betrayal was so monstrous that my brain actively fought to process the sheer cruelty of it. Rachel wasn't just an opportunistic widow who happened to sleep with her late husband's friend. She was the deeply malicious architect of my complete destruction. I handed over my life savings to protect my son's honor, and they used my grieving love to build a criminal empire. Jonathan Pierce slowly reached out and gently closed the lid of Mike's laptop, instantly cutting off the sickening video feed. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated resolve. He stated that we needed to stop examining the emotional wreckage and start dismantling their foundation. Jonathan pulled his computer from his briefcase and opened it on the table. He told me firmly that arrogant criminals always make mistakes when they grow overly confident with massive amounts of stolen cash. If Rachel and Todd were arrogant enough to openly admit how they allocated my specific funds, Jonathan could trace that financial pipeline with extreme precision to see where every single dollar went. For the next 3 agonizing hours, Jonathan conducted a masterclass in forensic corporate accounting. Using the router footprint Mike had intercepted, he accessed the offshore banking portal Todd was utilizing. He traced the original wire transfer I had sent to Rachel 8 months ago. We watched the digital ledger unfold before our eyes. Rachel had immediately transferred my $300,000 into an account under a shell company. From there, the stolen money was heavily fragmented. Jonathan managed to track the largest pieces, confirming that a massive chunk had indeed been wired to international heavy equipment brokers, fully validating Todd's boast about purchasing stolen front loaders. But Jonathan's eyes narrowed sharply as he highlighted a strange, irregular anomaly on the financial ledger. Out of my initial wire transfer, $75,000 had been diverted away from equipment procurement. It had been funneled into a separate domestic holding account. Jonathan cross-referenced the receiving account, pulling up a registry. The money had been deposited into a consulting firm owned by a man named Arthur Vance. Jonathan frowned, tapping his pen aggressively against the plastic table. He dug deeper into public records, pulling up Arthur Vance's official licensing credentials. When the full profile loaded on the bright screen, Mike Russo suddenly leaned forward, letting out a sharp, heavy breath. He pointed directly at a digital photo of a man with a thick gray mustache. Mike recognized him. Arthur Vance was a corrupt, disgraced former highway patrol officer currently operating as an independent collision investigator. He specialized in writing doctored accident reconstruction reports for shady insurance claims and corporate liability defenses. My blood turned completely cold. I remembered seeing Arthur Vance's name at the bottom of the police report regarding Matthew's accident. He was the independent expert who officially ruled that my son had simply lost control of his truck on a dangerous patch of black ice. Jonathan quickly highlighted the transaction dates. The timeline was damning. Just 3 days after Matthew's truck went into the rocky ravine, Arthur Vance received an initial payment of $25,000. That's $75,000. Drawn straight from my wire transfer was a delayed secondary payment. It was a massive hush payment. They used my own money to keep the man investigating my son's death completely silent. I stood up from the cheap plastic chair, my knees popping loudly in the quiet room. The truth crystallized in my mind, forming a picture so dark it nearly threatened my sanity. If Rachel and Todd had to pay a collision investigator over $100,000 in hush money, then Matthew's crash was never an accident. Mike slammed his laptop shut and grabbed his tactical jacket. He looked at me with cold, dangerous eyes. He stated that we weren't going to wait for federal authorities to build a case against a dirty cop. We were going to pay Arthur Vance a personal visit right now. We left Jonathan in the motel room to continue archiving the digital evidence. Mike and I climbed into my truck and drove silently through the freezing night air. Using his contacts, Mike locked down Arthur Vance's location. The investigator was operating out of a parking lot on the outskirts of town. We pulled into the empty lot just before dawn. Vance's rusty sedan was the only car parked outside an office building. We approached the heavy glass door. Mike didn't even bother knocking. He pulled out a tool and bypassed the lock in seconds. We stepped into the office. Arthur Vance was sitting behind a cheap metal desk, drinking a glass of whiskey while staring at a glowing monitor. He looked up, his eyes widening in terror, as Mike locked the door behind us and calmly pulled down the heavy window blinds. Mike walked straight across the room, slapping a stack of printouts onto Vance's desk. The documents clearly detailed the offshore wire transfers, moving from Todd and Rachel's shell company straight into his personal accounts. Mike didn't raise his voice. He spoke with quiet, lethal authority. He told Vance that we had breached the entire offshore syndicate, that the federal government would be seizing all his assets by the end of the week, and that he was currently looking at 20 years in federal prison for aiding corporate fraud and money laundering. Arthur Vance began to hyperventilate. His heavy chest heaved, sweat pouring down his face. He stammered frantically, claiming he was just a hired consultant, that he only wrote the reports he was paid to write, and that he had no idea how deep the criminal enterprise went. He swore he was just taking a standard fee to look the other way on a simple insurance claim. I slowly stepped out from the shadows near the door, walking up to his desk. Leaning down, I placed my hands flat on the cold metal surface, bringing my face inches from his terrified features. I told him my name. I told him I was Matthew Cole's father. I demanded he tell me exactly what he found when he pulled my son's truck out of that frozen ravine. Vance looked deep into my eyes and saw zero mercy. He began to weep, a pathetic sound echoing loudly in the small office. He confessed that when he inspected the chassis of the crushed vehicle, the main brake lines hadn't snapped from the impact. They had been deliberately severed with wire cutters before the truck ever left the driveway. He looked at me, shaking violently, and uttered the final truth. He sobbed that it wasn't an accident at all. Todd and Rachel had brutally sabotaged Matthew's truck to take over the entire company. Those horrific words hung heavy in the stale air of the small office. Sabotage. My son didn't die in a tragic winter accident on a dangerous patch of black ice. He was taken by the woman he loved and the man he trusted with his livelihood. For a terrifying second, the edges of my vision turned black. The floor beneath my heavy boots felt like it was collapsing into an endless, horrific void. A wave of intense, sickening nausea rolled through my stomach, threatening to drop me to my knees. The urge to scream out my agony, to wrap my hands around Arthur Vance's throat and squeeze until he stopped breathing, was overwhelming. But I didn't move an inch. I didn't shed a single visible tear. 40 years in commercial construction had fundamentally rewired my brain to react to catastrophic structural failures with absolute discipline. When a massive steel beam snaps or a concrete foundation develops a critical fracture, you don't stand in the rubble and cry, about to into the rain. You brace the surrounding structure, calculate the exact extent of the damage, and systematically dismantle the problem before it buries you completely. I forced myself to straighten my spine, drawing a deep, freezing breath into my aging lungs. Looking at the investigator, weeping behind his cheap metal desk, I felt nothing but pure, unadulterated contempt. I turned my back on him and walked out into the freezing parking lot, leaving Mike to extract every piece of recorded evidence Vance possessed. The entire drive back to the motel was spent in absolute silence. The winter sunrise so slowly painted the horizon in bruised shades of purple and dull gray. I gripped the leather steering wheel until my forearms ached, converting every ounce of my agonizing grief into a hard, laser-focused rage. When we pushed open the thin door to our rented room, Jonathan was still sitting at the small round table, his eyes bloodshot from an all-night forensic audit. Mike quickly briefed him on Vance's terrifying confession. Jonathan stopped typing, his hands resting motionless on the laptop keyboard. The ruthless corporate lawyer looked at me with a deep, quiet respect, silently acknowledging the devastating weight I was carrying. He offered no useless apologies or manufactured comfort. Instead, he simply tapped his computer screen, informing us that the offshore digital router was still highly active. Todd and Rachel had stayed inside that secure metal barn all night. I walked to the table and pulled out a cheap plastic chair. Leaning heavily forward, I locked my eyes onto the high-definition live video feed from the remote northern farm. The interior of the massive workshop was bathed in the harsh glare of industrial halogen lights. The stolen Caterpillar loader sat silently in the center of the concrete floor. In the second camera view, Todd and Rachel sat side by side behind Matthew's old wooden desk, buried in a messy pile of international logistics documents. The audio receiver hissed softly, capturing the sharp, rhythmic clicking of Todd's pen against the hard tabletop. They were wide awake, fueled by adrenaline and the enticing promise of massive, illegal wealth. I forced myself to watch the screen, suppressing the violent urge to smash the monitor to pieces. I needed to know exactly how they planned to complete their operation. I needed every detail of their exit strategy. I sat there, motionless, listening intently as the two people who took my only child casually planned their final move. Todd leaned back in the heavy leather desk chair, running a hand through his dark hair. He sounded exhausted, yet deeply satisfied. He patted a thick stack of printed customs declaration forms and stated that the overseas cargo vessel was officially scheduled to depart the main commercial port in exactly 4 days. Rachel sat motionless, casually filing her nails while listening to these highly illegal logistics arrangements. Todd smoothly outlined the final transaction parameters for his impatient partner. He confirmed that the overseas buyer represented a massive international syndicate deeply rooted in South America. This foreign entity would pay them a flat, negotiated price of exactly $2 million in completely untraceable offshore cryptocurrency for the re-tagged construction machinery. Rachel finally looked up from her manicured hands, her eyes flashing with unrestrained greed. She smiled brightly, smoothly calculating their respective profit margins out loud, openly discussing how quickly they could transfer the digital funds into their private holding accounts in the Cayman Islands. They talked about millions of dollars, with the casual ease of ordinary people, discussing a weekly grocery list. They were actively counting their massive wealth while standing directly on the grave of my late son. Todd reassured her that the secondary market buyers had already vetted the forged vehicle identification numbers and were completely satisfied with the paperwork. He boldly claimed that the heavy equipment would pass through standard port security without triggering a single automated alarm. The entire container shipping operation was a masterclass in corporate fraud. As I listened intently to their arrogant voices echoing through the tiny laptop speakers, I noticed a subtle edge of deep anxiety creep into Rachel's usually composed tone. Rachel stopped filing her nails and set her elbows heavily on the wooden desk. She stared at the tall stack of forged shipping manifests and newly printed corporate leases. She softly asked Todd what would happen if their digital firewalls failed in the real world. She wanted to know the exact response protocol. If a highly motivated federal investigator suddenly noticed the massive irregularities in their offshore bank transfers, her voice turned tight as she asked what would happen if an FBI tactical team kicked down the farm's massive aluminum bay doors before the international cargo ship cleared the harbor. She was terrified of spending the rest of her life in a federal prison. Todd showed not a single ounce of fear or hesitation. Reaching across the cluttered desk, he picked up the thick blue legal binder containing the offshore warehouse lease agreements. He dropped the heavy binder in front of Rachel, tapping his finger aggressively against the final page. He let out a laugh, a dark, completely soulless sound that chilled me to the bone. Todd smoothly reminded her that the title to the rural farm was permanently locked inside Matthew's estate, making it untouchable while the complex probate process dragged on. Then, he pointed confidently to the bold, forged signature at the bottom of the legal document. He looked at Rachel, his voice completely stripped of human empathy, as he delivered his final, devastating assurance. He told her clearly that while the farm was under Matthew's name, all the equipment leases were entirely under Harrison's name. He grinned wickedly, proudly declaring that if the FBI kicked the door down, the 70-year-old man would take the fall. They would take the cash and vanish. The heavy weight of Todd's chilling statement hung thick and suffocating in the stale motel room air. They had actually factored my freedom into their profit margins. My lungs burned as I fought against an overwhelming physical urge to drive my fist right through the glowing computer display. I wanted to drive my truck straight through those heavy aluminum doors, wrap my hands around their throats, and demand to know how my child died. But that kind of blind, explosive rage is exactly what gets a man killed. 40 years in the commercial construction industry had fundamentally restructured my entire nervous system. When a massive steel support column buckles and an entire foundation faces catastrophic failure, you don't waste precious seconds weeping over the dust. You suppress the panic with brutal discipline. You stabilize the surrounding structure, and you dismantle the threat with surgical precision before it buries you alive. I forced my spine flat against the hard plastic of the motel chair, clenching my jaw so tight my teeth ached. I refused to break. I would not give them the satisfaction of destroying me. Drawing a long, ragged breath of stale, cold air into my lungs, I locked every ounce of my remaining focus onto the glowing screen. Mike and Jonathan watched me in respectful silence, instinctively understanding that the grieving father had vanished, replaced entirely by a man prepared to launch a full-scale war. On the main camera feed, Todd leaned his weight against the bright yellow frame of the stolen Caterpillar loader, his eyes sweeping across the massive chop shop with deep, terrifying satisfaction. Turning his attention back to Rachel, he smoothly transitioned from the cold reality of framing me to the lucrative logistics of their upcoming exit strategy. He confirmed that the offshore holding company had successfully verified the routing numbers for the $2 million cryptocurrency transfer. The international buyers operating deep in South America were completely satisfied with custom vehicle identification numbers. Todd explained that the ocean shipping containers were secured and would be loaded onto the commercial freighter at the port of Newark in exactly 96 hours. Rachel rested her elbows on the wooden desk, her body trembling with greedy, toxic adrenaline. She quickly calculated their exact offshore profit margins out loud, gushing about how they would permanently disappear to a private gated estate in Costa Rica once the digital funds cleared. They spoke about their impending wealth with the casual ease of tourists, planning a weekend getaway. They were celebrating their victory directly on top of the blood-soaked empire taken from my late son. But as the conversation shifted away from international logistics, a sharp, raw edge of anxiety crept into Rachel's voice. Standing up from the heavy leather desk chair, she began nervously pacing within the tight frame of the hidden ceiling camera. Her expensive designer heels clicked sharply against the cold concrete floor. She wrapped her arms tightly across her crimson blouse, her brow furrowed with genuine concern. She told Todd she was deeply worried about the immediate timeline. The 4-day wait for the foreign payment felt agonizing, and they desperately needed liquid cash to bribe the corrupt dock officials and port inspectors facilitating the container loading process. Biting her lower lip, Rachel glanced nervously toward the dark windows of the barn. She stated that they had completely exhausted the initial $300,000 I had given her. The only available funds left to cover the massive spiled was my protected union pension fund. But Rachel was terrified. She argued that withdrawing hundreds of thousands of dollars directly from my personal retirement account would trigger massive bank alerts. She reminded Todd that I was a meticulous, disciplined contractor who checked my financial statements religiously every single day. She panicked, whispering that if I noticed the missing pension before the freighter cleared the harbor, I would immediately call state authorities and burn their entire operation to the ground before they could escape to the tropics. Todd simply laughed. It was a dark, venomous sound echoing through the tiny laptop speakers, stripped of any recognizable human empathy. Pushing himself off the heavy machinery, he walked back to the administrative desk. Reaching deep inside his heavy winter parka, he pulled out a sealed manila medical envelope and tossed it casually onto the desk, right in front of Rachel's trembling hands. He told her not to panic like an amateur. He stated that he had spent the last 3 weeks meticulously preparing a bulletproof, utterly devastating contingency plan designed specifically for this exact scenario. Todd smoothly explained that he had used a significant portion of stolen cash to heavily bribe a deeply corrupt, highly credentialed private neurologist affiliated with a prominent state medical institution. He instructed Rachel to open the thick envelope and read the official diagnosis. Rachel carefully broke the seal and pulled out the crisp medical documents. As her eyes scanned the clinical text, her panicked expression quickly mutated into a broad, purely evil smile. The documents were a perfectly forged, fully certified medical assessment, legally declaring that Harrison Cole was suffering from severe, rapidly deteriorating, and aggressively combative Alzheimer's disease. The corrupt physician had officially documented a completely fabricated history of dangerous cognitive decline, severe memory loss, and threatening paranoid delusions. The medical evaluation was a masterpiece of psychological destruction, legally framing me as a man who was a danger to himself and a direct threat to the public. Rachel gently traced her finger over the prominent blue ink stamp, the specialist's forged medical signature, and let out a soft, almost breathless gasp of pure admiration. Looking up at Todd, her eyes shone with a dark, romantic worship for the cold-hearted monster standing before her. She asked him how they were going to seamlessly execute this master stroke against my life. Todd leaned his full weight heavily against the polished wooden desk, his face perfectly illuminated by the harsh overhead halogen lights. He looked straight up, completely unaware that his cold, soulless eyes were piercing directly into the lens of our hidden microcamera. Smiling brightly, he proudly showed a row of white teeth, dealing a final, devastating blow to my entire peaceful existence. His cruel voice was smooth, dripping with an absolute, sickening confidence that froze the blood, coursing through my pounding heart solid. Todd let out a low, sinister rumble of a chuckle through the tactical laptop's small speaker. He pointed a shockingly steady index finger straight at the fraudulent medical paperwork on the desk. "We don't have to worry about the old fool noticing the missing pension," Todd announced with chilling, terrible certainty. "We freeze his accounts on Friday, throw him into a state psychiatric facility, and become his legal conservators." The absolute weight of that degraded statement hung thick in the stale, suffocating air of the tiny motel room. They weren't satisfied with merely stealing my life savings or destroying my flawless professional reputation. They were actively conspiring to legally strip away my basic human autonomy, declare me insane, and lock me in a heavily medicated nightmare for the rest of my days. The calculated cruelty hit me like a wave of ice water. I stared at the glowing screen, watching Rachel smile back at Todd with unvarnished adoration. She showed not a single shred of hesitation or moral conflict. The woman I had welcomed into my home, the grieving widow I had held as she wept at my son's grave, was enthusiastically celebrating the theft of my freedom. Beside me, Jonathan Pierce let out a sharp, raspy breath, his legal mind struggling to process the depth of their malice. Mike Russo remained motionless, his hard features carved from stone, his eyes locked onto the live feed. I gripped the flimsy plastic edge of the folding table until my knuckles burned with pain. Every fiber of my aging body vibrated with a primal, explosive rage I had never experienced in my entire life. I wanted to tear the computer monitor right off the table. I wanted to crash through the heavy aluminum doors of my own workshop and wrap my calloused hands around their throats. But 40 years of discipline in the commercial construction industry clamped down hard on my fracturing mind. When you are tasked with safely dismantling collapsing concrete structure, you don't recklessly swing a sledgehammer at the primary load-bearing walls. You strategically analyze the structural weaknesses. You systematically isolate the core foundation, and you orchestrate a complete collapse entirely on your own terms. I forced back the choking bile rising in my throat, directing my burning eyes fully back to the high-definition digital display. I refused to look away from the monsters who executed my only child. On the digital broadcast, the atmosphere inside the lit office suddenly shifted. The cold, highly methodical discussion of lucrative international shipping and my upcoming psychiatric confinement dissolved into something far more intimate and sinister. Todd slowly pushed his heavy body away from the polished wood of Matthew's old desk. He took a deliberate, measured step toward Rachel, his tall frame dominating the tight camera angle. The blinding industrial lights cast long, jagged shadows across the cold concrete floor. Reaching a gloved hand deep into an inner pocket of his heavy winter parka, Todd slowly pulled his hand out, his fingers curled tight around a hidden object. Rachel tilted her head, her features lighting up with genuine intense curiosity. She took an eager step toward him, her expensive leather boots clicking sharply against the hard floor. She coyly asked if he had finally managed to retrieve the special collateral they discussed earlier. Todd gave her a broad, arrogant grin that twisted his face into a terrifying mask of pure evil. He slowly uncurled his fist, extending his broad palm under the unyielding overhead light. Lying innocently in the center of his calloused palm was a breathtaking, perfectly preserved piece of vintage jewelry. The brilliant, flawlessly cut stone caught the harsh artificial light, casting a deep, shimmering green reflection across the cluttered desk. It was an intricately designed, custom-made ring completely encircled by flawless, brilliant-cut diamonds. My breath stopped. The air vanished from my burning lungs. The motel room began to spin violently around me. My heart battered wildly against my ribs in a frantic, irregular rhythm that threatened to tear through my chest. I recognized that gorgeous, unique piece of jewelry immediately. It was the vintage emerald ring I had personally placed on my late wife's finger over 45 years ago. Back then, I worked grueling back-to-back double shifts on massive commercial roofing projects for 6 straight months, just to afford that special, deeply cherished gem. When my beautiful wife passed away, I lovingly handed the heirloom down to my only son, instructing Matthew to give it to the woman he truly wanted to spend the rest of his life with. When Matthew joyfully slipped that emerald ring onto Rachel's finger, I foolishly believed our family legacy was permanently secured. After that terrible crash, I had desperately asked Rachel if police investigators managed to recover the sentimental piece from the wreckage. She looked me dead in the eye, shedding hysterical, heartbroken tears, and solemnly swore the precious ring had been fired in the intense fire heat that consumed the crushed truck. That unforgivable lie was now sparkling right on the screen in front of me. The ring was never lost in that icy ravine. It was never incinerated in the burning metal of my son's wrecked vehicle. Before County Road Patrol authorities even arrived at the remote scene, Todd had personally stripped this priceless heirloom from my dead son's cold, lifeless body. He had kept it safely hidden away, as a sick, gruesome trophy of his successful assassination. Rachel stared down at the beautiful emerald, letting out a soft, excited gasp of pure delight. She eagerly extended her left hand toward her lover, her fingers trembling with pure expectation. She showed not an ounce of grief, guilt, or moral hesitation. She was happily accepting her murdered husband's stolen, blood-stained ring from the man who brutally orchestrated his tragic death. Todd gently pinched the emerald ring between his thick fingers. Slowly, deliberately, he slid the piece onto Rachel's extended finger. They paused, admiring the deep green stone sparkling under the industrial lights. Todd let out a low, dark laugh that vibrated through the laptop speaker. He leaned forward, wrapping his thick arms around her waist. Looking down into her eyes, his voice dropped to a sinister whisper, echoing clearly through our hidden microphone. Todd smiled wickedly, without a shred of basic human empathy, and delivered his final, soul-shattering confession. Matthew was bleeding out, begging me to pull the emergency brake. I just turned the radio up. The digital screen went black. I shut the monitor down. The time for investigation was over. Now, it was time for war. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the heavy laptop against the motel room's cheap wood paneling. Nor did I collapse onto the thin carpet, weeping for my murdered son. The time for raw, paralyzing grief was officially over, replaced by a cold, highly calculated resolve for complete destruction. Spending 40 long years pouring concrete foundations and erecting massive steel frames taught me early on that achieving true structural integrity requires immense patience, deliberate planning, and zero emotional interference. When a building is collapsing around you, panic is a death sentence. Taking a steady breath, I felt the cold air fill my lungs, forcing away the crushing agony tearing at my chest. Jonathan Pierce and Mike Russo watched me in absolute, respectful silence, waiting for my final orders. I stared at the dark display, locking away the haunting memory of my late wife's vintage emerald ring, and simply nodded. We went to work immediately. Over the next few agonizing hours, the cramped motel room transformed into a disciplined tactical command center. Not a single unnecessary word was spoken. Mike silently downloaded every frame of high-definition video and crystal-clear audio from the micro cameras hidden inside the metal barn. He created triple-encrypted digital backups on heavy-duty solid-state drives, permanently securing Todd and Rachel's sickeningly arrogant conversations, their embrace over stolen machinery, and their detailed discussions of international shipping logistics. Jonathan worked tirelessly beside him, finalizing an undeniable digital paper trail. He compiled the illegal offshore bank routing numbers, forged vehicle identification plates, and well-documented wire transfers connecting my draining pension directly to that disgraced collision investigator. Finally, we placed Arthur Vance's official right at the top of our massive confession, right at the top of our massive evidence file. We had surgically isolated every load-bearing pillar of their lucrative, blood-soaked criminal ring. We possessed absolute motive, undeniable means, and overwhelming financial evidence of a premeditated corporate murder. The dark foundation of their complex lies was fully exposed and ready to be detonated. We just needed a wrecking ball, massive enough to shatter their world instantly. Jonathan closed his leather binder and pulled out his encrypted phone. As a ruthless corporate attorney, he possessed a vast, deeply entrenched network of influential government contacts, bypassing local and county authorities entirely. Knowing municipal jurisdictions could be compromised or bogged down in frustrating bureaucratic delays. Jonathan dialed a specialized federal task force operating out of the regional government field office. He contacted a senior federal agent, specifically tasked with dismantling complex, highly lucrative interstate racketeering operations and financially motivated corporate homicides. Jonathan was clear and direct with his words. He calmly, methodically laid out the unbelievable scale of the operation. He detailed millions of dollars in stolen heavy equipment, perfectly forged offshore warehouse leases drafted in my name, and decisive, undeniable forensic evidence of a deliberate, fatal sabotage. He transmitted a compressed digital packet straight to the senior agent, containing our primary evidence. We sat together in the quiet freezing room, listening to the heavy silence while federal authorities verified the massive scale of the intelligence we had provided. Less than 40 minutes later, the senior federal agent called Jonathan back. The specialized task force had fully mobilized. The sheer weight of our evidence, especially the calculated murder of a civilian to facilitate an international machinery smuggling ring, triggered a top priority federal response. They were fully prepared to deploy a heavily armed, highly trained tactical unit to execute a raid on the rural farm property. However, the senior agent outlined an absolute non-negotiable strategic requirement for a legally flawless sting operation. To secure airtight, inescapable federal indictments that would lock Todd and Rachel in a maximum security prison for the rest of their lives. Authorities needed to catch them red-handed in the very middle of a massive transaction. Federal agents couldn't simply raid an empty barn or mistakenly arrest an uninformed low-level associate. The task force required Todd and Rachel to be physically present inside the chop shop at the exact same moment, surrounded by stolen industrial loaders, holding freshly forged international shipping manifests and carrying the reinforced titanium briefcase packed with laundered cash. Agents needed both masterminds fully isolated and trapped within their illegal environment. Knew exactly how to deliver them directly to federal authorities without raising a single suspicion. Reaching into the deep pocket of my heavy winter coat, I pulled out my personal phone. I needed to feed Rachel the specific narrative she desperately wanted to hear. I had to guarantee she felt completely secure, confident, and unmonitored for the next 48 hours, while they finalized their lucrative international deal at my late son's desecrated property. Opening my messaging application, I carefully drafted a short, apologetic text to my hypocritical daughter-in-law. I phrased the message to sound like a helpless, overburdened old man politely bowing out of her busy schedule. I typed that my lonely winter cruise had encountered severe, unexpected weather delays at the main coastal port. I smoothly informed her that I was completely stuck out of town and delayed from returning to the area. Assuring her she had nothing to worry about regarding the rural property, I gently instructed her to focus entirely on her own quiet grieving process. I completed the trap by explicitly stating, "My cruise is delayed, and I won't be back for another week." I hit send, permanently sealing their fate. The trap was set. Right then, in the freezing darkness of that winter night, the absolute countdown to their inescapable legal destruction officially began. A freezing winter wind howled across the desolate, snow-covered property, biting brutally at the exposed skin on my face and hands. It was late Friday night, exactly 96 hours since I sent that calculated text message to Rachel. The tactical perimeter had been established long before the sun dipped behind the dark tree line. Mike Russo and Jonathan Pierce were stationed in a blackout mobile command center parked off the main dirt driveway, hidden in the dense woods. Surrounding the entire reinforced concrete structure was a specialized, heavily armed federal task force. They were completely invisible in the freezing dark, wearing white winter camouflage that blended into the snowdrifts. Weapons drawn, tactical radios silent. They waited patiently for my precise, predetermined signal. I stood alone near the edge of the tree line, staring directly at the brightly lit, frost-covered windows of the massive metal barn my murdered son and I had built with our own hands. I wasn't wearing my old winter work clothes or my standard worn contractor boots. I had dressed up deliberately for the occasion, wearing a tailored black suit, a crisp white shirt, and a dark silk tie. It was the exact suit I wore to Matthew's funeral. I wore it now as a silent statement that I was about to reclaim justice on his behalf. I stood tall, my shoulders pulled back, letting 40 years of discipline in commercial construction strengthen my spine. I was no longer the heartbroken, grieving old man they thought they had outsmarted. I was the architect of their impending destruction. Tucked firmly under my right arm was the heavy blue legal binder, containing every piece of documented forensic evidence. Transcripts of the video footage, offshore bank routing numbers, forged warehouse leases, and Arthur Vance's formal, sworn homicide confession. The binder felt heavy, a physical manifestation of the crushing grief and burning rage I had carried in silence for months. A rhythmic bass thudded from inside the barn, vibrating the cold, corrugated steel walls. They were holding a private, arrogant celebration. The $2 million offshore cryptocurrency transfer from the South American syndicate had cleared their complex digital firewalls. Just an hour ago, the international ocean shipping containers were packed, loaded, and prepared for transport to the busy commercial port in Tehuantepec under the cover of night. They thought they had won. They genuinely believed they had successfully taken my only child, stolen my professional identity, and secured a lavish, illegal retirement. I stepped out. I stepped out of the freezing shadows, walking deliberately through the packed snow on the main driveway. I made no attempt to hide my footsteps, walking with a heavy, authoritative rhythm straight toward the main aluminum roll-up door. Reaching the side access entrance, I grabbed the cold metal handle. I didn't bother picking the lock or pushing the heavy door open gently. Throwing my shoulder into it with every ounce of strength I had left, I shoved the heavy steel frame inward. The door slammed violently against the interior concrete wall with a loud, echoing boom that instantly shattered the arrogant celebration inside. The freezing winter wind rushed into the heated space, scattering loose shipping manifests across the floor. I crossed the threshold, stepping out of the dark, straight into the harsh, blinding glare of the industrial halogen lights. Standing tall in the doorway, I blocked their only exit, radiating an absolute authority that drained the room of all its oxygen. Todd and Rachel stood near the front grille of a massive black SUV, parked in the center of the concrete floor. They were wearing expensive winter clothes, clearly prepared for their upcoming flight to the tropics. Todd held a crystal champagne glass in his left hand, while Rachel held a matching glass, leaning comfortably against the dark, polished hood of the vehicle. When I burst through the door, they were actively toasting to their blood-soaked victory. Loud music continued to thud through the speakers, but both of them froze instantly, paralyzed in absolute shock. The color drained from Todd's face, turning his usual aggressive expression into a pale mask of pure panic. He stared at my tailored black suit, his eyes darting frantically to the heavy blue binder tucked under my arm. Rachel flinched, the expensive crystal champagne glass slipping directly from her trembling fingers. The delicate glass shattered against the hard concrete floor into 1,000 sparkling pieces, splashing sparkling liquid over the toes of her designer boots. For a desperate second, pure terror flashed across her wide eyes. But then her deep-seated self-preservation instinct kicked in. I watched in silent disgust as she physically rearranged her facial features. She forced her tense shoulders to relax and quickly plastered a broad, trembling smile across her face, frantically trying to revert to the sweet, fragile daughter-in-law she had portrayed for months. She took a hesitant, unsteady step toward me, her voice pitched in a high, forced tone of fake relief. "Dad!" Rachel gasped, throwing her empty hands into the air in a dramatic, exaggerated display of surprise. "Oh my God, what are you doing here? I thought you were in Florida." "Your text said the cruise was delayed and you wouldn't be back for another week." She let out a short, breathless laugh, glancing nervously at Todd before looking back at my stiff, unmoving face. "You completely startled us. We just came out here to finalize some confusing old shipping logistics Matthew left behind before packing up the office." Taking another slow, calculated step toward me, the edges of her fake smile trembled violently. "Dad, why are you wearing a suit?" Are you okay? I didn't say a word. Ignoring her pathetic, desperate performance, I maintained cold, terrifying eye contact, my gaze burning with an unforgiving rage. I walked slowly, deliberately, past Todd's paralyzed, trembling frame, stopping right in front of the stolen black SUV. Raising my right arm, I slammed the heavy blue binder onto the polished metal hood. The heavy legal file landed with a loud thud that brought dead silence to the room. The blue binder sat there like a ticking time bomb. Todd stared at it, his chest heaving, before his greedy hands reached out to slowly open the thick cover. Distu. He looked down at the first page. A high-definition photo of him and Rachel embraced over the hood of the stolen loader, captured straight from our hidden ceiling camera just 48 hours ago. Todd flipped to the next page, his hands shaking violently as he saw the compiled bank routing numbers, highlighted offshore cryptocurrency transactions, and undeniable documents connecting his shell company to the South American syndicate. But it was the third page that finally shattered his composure. A sworn, notarized copy of Arthur Vance's official confession detailing the deliberately cut brake lines on my son's truck. Todd stumbled backward, slamming heavily against the grille of the SUV. The weight of his complete exposure crashed down on him. The lucrative criminal empire he had built on my son's grave was disintegrating before his eyes. He looked up at me, his face twisting from pale terror into a mask of pure, murderous rage. In that moment, he realized that the seemingly clueless, grieving 70-year-old man had systematically dismantled his entire life. Rachel peered over the edge of the binder, her eyes scanning the incriminating documents. She let out a sharp, hysterical scream, backing away from the desk until her spine hit the cold, corrugated steel wall of the barn. Her persona as a helpless widow evaporated completely, replaced by the raw, animalistic terror of a woman facing a lifetime in federal prison. I stood my ground, my posture rigid, my hands resting calmly at my sides. I didn't blink. I didn't step back. Looking at the man who ordered the brutal execution of my son, I spoke with a quiet, lethal authority that echoed deeply through the cold, open space. I told him that every dollar he had stolen was completely frozen by the federal government. I informed him that authorities had already seized the ocean shipping containers waiting in Newark, and that the South American syndicate was fully aware he had blown their deal. I made sure he understood that he had absolutely nothing left. No money, no way out, and no future. Todd let out a guttural, terrifying roar of absolute, unbridled rage. The carefully maintained illusion of a charming, supportive business partner vanished completely. He was a trapped, desperate predator, driven only by raw self-preservation. Reaching rapidly behind his back, he pushed aside the heavy fabric of his winter parka and drew a heavy, dark metal handgun from his waistband. He raised the weapon, pointing the dark, trembling barrel straight at the center of my chest. Rachel screamed again, covering her ears and dropping into a defensive crouch behind the heavy wooden desk. Todd clicked the safety off with a sharp metallic snap. His jaw clenched so tight it looked like his teeth might shatter. He screamed that I was going to die on that cold concrete floor just like my son did in the snow, and that he would happily burn the entire barn to the ground with my body locked inside. He took a heavy step toward me, his finger visibly tightening on the trigger. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my hands to protect myself, nor did I utter a single word of protest or fear. I simply looked straight down the dark barrel of his weapon and waited. I had spent 40 years building massive structural foundations designed to withstand violent hurricanes and devastating earthquakes. I was not going to collapse or cower before a pathetic coward. Before Todd could close the remaining physical distance between us, the entire perimeter of the freezing rural farm erupted. A blinding sea of violently flashing red and blue strobe lights suddenly pierced through every frost-covered window of the massive metal structure. Deafening, ear-splitting. Siren shattered the quiet winter night, echoing across the desolate, snow-covered fields with overwhelming force. The sheer physical pressure of the sound made the ground beneath our boots vibrate. Todd froze, his eyes darting frantically toward the rattling aluminum roll-up doors. As the brutal reality of the massive ambush finally registered in his panicked mind, his focus shifted away from me. He spun around, desperately searching for a rear exit. The heavy handgun trembled violently in his grip, but it was already too late. There was no way out. A massive, heavily armored black federal tactical vehicle crashed violently through the heavy wooden gate at the top of the dirt driveway. The roaring engine completely drowned out the loud music still playing inside the chop shop. A second armored vehicle followed close behind, its tires tearing through the packed winter snow, cutting off any potential escape route. The front bumper of the lead tactical vehicle slammed directly into the barn's primary aluminum roll-up door. The massive metal panels buckled inward, tearing violently from their heavy steel hinges with a deafening screech. The freezing winter wind howled directly into the building, bringing with it a highly coordinated team of heavily armed federal tactical agents. Dressed in black tactical gear, they flooded through the destroyed entrance in a tight military formation, raising high-powered assault rifles. Bright white laser sights danced across the dark industrial machinery, locking instantly onto Todd's towering, panicked frame. A deep, amplified voice boomed from a tactical megaphone outside, demanding that Todd drop his weapon immediately and get down on the concrete floor. The sheer, overwhelming show of force from the federal task force was absolute. Todd stood completely paralyzed for a brief, foolish second, his weapon still hovering dangerously in the freezing air. He looked at the vast team of heavily armed agents, then back at me, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure defeat. He realized that before he could even think about pulling the trigger, he was hopelessly outnumbered and completely outgunned. 3 tactical agents moved forward with terrifying speed, hitting Todd with the combined force of a speeding freight train. The heavy metal handgun was kicked violently from his grip, sliding harmlessly across the smooth concrete floor. The agents slammed Todd face down onto the cold ground, the harsh impact echoing crisply. 2 agents pinned him down, securing his arms behind his back and snapping heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. Todd groaned in pain, his previous arrogance completely replaced by the pathetic sounds of a trapped criminal. Rachel collapsed to her knees, screaming and begging V for mercy, claiming that Todd had forced her into everything. I looked down at the woman trembling on the cold concrete floor, surrounded by the tactical team. Her manicured hands were yanked behind her back and secured with cold steel cuffs. The harsh glare of the halogen lights illuminated tracks of black mascara running down her tear-stained cheeks. She sobbed hysterically, her sharp voice echoing off the corrugated metal walls. She raved that she was an innocent victim, an unwilling pawn manipulated by an unstable man. She swore to God and my late son's memory that she had never wanted any of this to happen. I didn't blink. I offered no words of comfort, nor did I show a single shred of sympathy. Her frantic tears were entirely useless against the impenetrable fortress of my anger. I knew the absolute truth. I had spent hours watching the hidden surveillance footage, listening to her calculate offshore profit margins, and eagerly plan my psychiatric confinement. Walking forward with a stiff posture, my polished shoes tapping rhythmically against the smooth floor, I stopped directly in front of her kneeling frame. The federal agents instinctively stepped back, granting me the undisputed authority of the moment. Without screaming, I reached out and caught her cold left hand. She let out a sharp gasp, flinching from my silence. Without a word, I used my calloused fingers to grip the gorgeous gem resting on her trembling finger, pulling the vintage emerald ring directly off her hand. Clenching the precious heirloom, I felt the cold metal press deep into my palm. I smoothly slid the beautiful ring directly into the breast pocket of my tailored black suit, safely returning my late wife's most cherished possession to where it belonged, directly against my beating heart. Rachel looked up at me, her eyes wide with total realization. She finally understood that her performance as an innocent widow had failed completely. Todd was yanked up from the hard concrete floor by two tactical agents. His face was bruised, and a dark trail of blood dripped slowly from his split lip, staining the white collar of his expensive winter shirt. His hands were bound tightly behind his back, his shoulders pinned awkwardly. He glared at me with pure venom, his dark eyes burning with the absolute fury of a defeated animal. He spat a string of aggressive insults in my direction, desperately attempting to salvage some tiny shred of his shattered pride. The lead federal agent, an imposing man wearing a heavy tactical vest, stepped smoothly between us. He ordered Todd to remain completely silent, his voice vibrating with unquestionable authority. The senior agent directed his focused gaze to me. Turning my back on the bleeding murderer, I walked toward the hood of the stolen black SUV, placing my right hand on the compiled blue binder. I slowly opened the cover, revealing the overwhelming mountain of forensic evidence. I carefully pulled out the fraudulent medical paperwork that declared I suffered from severe cognitive decline, handing the white pages directly to the lead federal agent. I watched his stern eyes scan the corrupt psychological assessment. Then, I pulled out the fully transcribed and notarized digital confession, detailing the deliberately cut brake lines on my son's commercial truck. The federal agent accepted the stack of evidence with a respectful nod. He calmly assured me that the task force possessed everything necessary to ensure both conspirators received multiple, inescapable life sentences. In the eyes of the federal justice system, their lives were effectively over. The deafening chaos of the tactical raid slowly transitioned into the highly methodical rhythm of a massive federal crime scene investigation. Heavy flatbed tow trucks began navigating down the dirt driveway, positioning themselves to seize the multi-million-dollar inventory of stolen industrial machinery. Dozens of trained forensic technicians swarmed into the metal barn, meticulously cataloging the forged vehicle identification plates, international shipping manifests, and the reinforced titanium briefcase packed with laundered cash. The lead federal agent signaled to his tactical team. Fully armed agents grabbed Todd and Rachel by their bound shoulders, escorting them directly out of the lit workshop and into the cold, unforgiving winter darkness. I walked slowly out through the massive aluminum roll-up door, standing quietly on the packed snow to watch the final, satisfying act of their destruction. Rachel was pushed into the dark back seat of a federal cruiser, her sharp screams completely muted by the heavy bulletproof glass. Todd was loaded into a separate, high-security transport vehicle, his tall frame forced into the narrow, caged interior. The heavy metal doors slammed shut with a decisive, resonant thud that echoed across the barren, frozen farmland. Bright red and blue strobe lights painted the surrounding pine trees in rapid, sweeping colors. The massive convoy of federal tactical vehicles turned around, their heavy tires crunching loudly over the frozen gravel. I stood motionless, hands resting calmly in my pockets, watching the formidable fleet of law enforcement slowly disappear down the dark country road. The flashing emergency lights faded into the pitch-black horizon, taking the cold-hearted murderers out of my life forever. The intense chaos of the federal raid vanished completely, replaced by the deep, heavy silence of the rural winter night. A cold wind swept across the desolate, snow-covered farm, whispering gently through the bare branches of the frozen trees. I stood entirely alone in the center of the vast dirt driveway. The massive empire built on greed, absolute deception, and brutal premeditated murder had been completely, surgically dismantled from the inside out. Reaching my cold right hand deep into the breast pocket of my tailored black suit, my calloused fingers brushed over the smooth, flawless surface of my late wife's vintage emerald ring. The cherished family heirloom was finally safe. The crushing weight of absolute retribution, alongside the raw, explosive anger that had sustained my aging body through weeks of dangerous surveillance, slowly began to drain from my tired bones. Looking up at the vast winter sky, I felt cold snowflakes fall gently against my warm cheeks. The corrupt foundation of their criminal enterprise had been permanently destroyed. They would rot endlessly in a maximum security federal prison, completely stripped of their stolen wealth and unearned freedom. Yet as I turned to gaze silently at the empty metal barn, I realized that the most difficult part of this devastating journey was not the strategic dismantling of their criminal empire. The heavy truth rested on my shoulders. The profound work of truly honoring my late son's stolen legacy was only just beginning. A harsh winter slowly surrendered to a bright, hopeful spring. 3 grueling months had passed since the chaotic night the massive metal barn was raided, and my entire world was shattered and reset. The subsequent federal trial was swift and unyielding. The overwhelming mountain of digital evidence, encrypted offshore banking traces, and devastating homicide confessions proved completely insurmountable for their expensive defense attorneys. Entirely silent, sat in the quiet courtroom, completely stripped of their usual arrogance and deceptive charm. Both received consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, permanently remanded to a maximum security federal facility for interstate racketeering and the premeditated murder of my son. On the day of their sentencing, I sat erect in the front row of the gallery, wearing my tailored black suit, watching the heavy wooden doors close behind them forever. Knowing that my only child had finally received absolute justice, I felt a massive weight physically lift from my shoulders. I walked out of that federal courthouse with my head held high, ready to rebuild my broken life. With the criminal proceedings officially concluded, I immediately set about systematically clearing my son's professional name. I dismissed their legal representation, secured complete, uncontested control of the rural farm property, and carefully liquidated every piece of legitimate heavy machinery. I refused to let any corrupt corporate funds tarnish my family's reputation. Instead, I funneled my remaining personal capital, the union pension they had so greedily targeted, into a brand new foundation. I completely gutted the massive metal barn, stripping away the cold concrete remains of their illegal chop shop. Jonathan Pierce handled the complex legal filings, while Mike Russo helped me dismantle the old interior walls by hand. We worked side by side from sunrise to sunset, replacing the dark history of that building with genuine, positive purpose. In its place, I constructed a state-of-the-art, non-profit vocational school dedicated to teaching young adults commercial construction and heavy machinery operation. I named the institution after my son, permanently ensuring that Matthew's incredible legacy would be defined by education, hard work, and opportunity, rather than violent deception and greed. On this beautiful morning, I sit quietly on the broad wooden porch of the main farmhouse, holding a warm cup of black coffee. The rhythmic sounds of power tools, heavy diesel engines, and enthusiastic instructors echo proudly from the newly renovated barn down the long driveway. It is a beautiful symphony of honest, hard work. Taking a deep, slow breath of the fresh spring morning air, I look up at the wall beside the front door. Hanging perfectly level in a simple black frame is not a prestigious business award or a fancy university diploma. It is a heavily creased, slightly faded piece of standard paper. It is that original 523 electric bill. That seemingly minor anomaly served as the absolute catalyst for unraveling an entire blood-stained empire of lies. It stands as a permanent daily reminder to always trust my instincts and never ignore even the smallest structural crack in a foundation. I am 70 years old now, a man who has weathered the absolute darkest storms of human betrayal, calculated manipulation, and deep, suffocating grief. But as I sit here listening to the crisp sounds of a new generation building their futures, I feel a deep, profound sense of peace wash over my aging bones. For the first time after a long, painful year, I finally feel truly alive, immensely strong, and entirely at peace within myself. The foundation is whole once more, permanently reinforced by the enduring memory of my beloved son. Evil often hides behind the most convincing tears and the warmest smiles, manipulating our deepest grief to satisfy its own insatiable greed. When your instincts scream in the dark that something is wrong, you have to find the courage to turn on the light, no matter how terrifying the truth behind it might be. A relationship built on a foundation of betrayal holds no true value. Real strength isn't about avoiding immense pain. It's about standing tall when your world shatters, methodically reclaiming your power, and ensuring that justice triumphs over deception. Have you ever completely trusted someone, only to discover a chilling betrayal hiding right under your nose? How did you manage to find the strength to fight back? Share your personal experiences in the comments below. Be sure to hit the subscribe button to join our active community today.